Hey folks, and welcome to episode 4 of my Ear Stretching 101 series. If you have not watched this series from the beginning, please go back and do so, or else you're going to miss out on a lot of important information. And when it comes to stretching your ears, you really want to know as much about it as you can. In this video, I'll be going over the safest methods of ear stretching, more specifically tapering, taping, and dead stretching / using weights. Regardless of which method you're going to use, your earlobe piercings should be fully healed, which usually takes around 5 to 6 months. However, if it takes longer for you, don't rush it. Don't start stretching your ears until the piercing is fully healed. I'm going to start off with stretching with tapers because that's probably the most popular method. So this is what a stretching taper looks like. The wider and straight end on your right is where we actually take the measurement of the taper from. This one is a 2 gauge. And then as you can see, it tapers down narrower and narrower into a point. So all the things you will need in order to stretch your ears with the tapering method: 1 steel or titanium taper in every size between where you're currently at and your goal size, so the final size that you're hoping to stretch to. Quick side note on tapers, a lot of people, including myself, would recommend that once you reach a 2 gauge, stop using tapers and move on to a different method. The reason for that is because the size difference between a 2 gauge and a 0 gauge is 2 millimeters. And then there's another 2 millimeter size difference between a 0 gauge and a 00 gauge. And this 2 millimeter jump in sizes is pretty significant. And so when you're stretching up by 2 millimeters in one go, it does increase your risk of things like tearing and blowouts. So just to be on the safe side, stop using tapers at a 2 gauge. You will also need steel, titanium, or glass plugs or eyelets, 1 or 2 depending on how many lobes you are stretching. And again, you will need those in every single size. In case you're not sure what I mean by every single size, a standard earlobe piercing is done at an 18 gauge. Gauge measurements are kind of backwards, so as the number gets smaller, the diameter gets larger. So if you are starting at an 18 gauge, you need a taper and 1 or 2 plugs, again depending on how many lobes you're stretching, in every size from 16, 14, 12, 10, 8, 6, 4, and 2. There are also half sizes, which are the odd numbers between each of those gauges, but they can be pretty difficult to come by. 16 gauge tapers can be a bit tricky to find. I know that they are available on body art forms, so even though 16 gauge tapers are harder to find, I would strongly recommend not skipping that size. If you were to stretch from an 18 gauge to a 14 gauge, that is a 0.6 millimeter jump, whereas the size increase between an 18 and a 16 gauge is only 0.2 millimeters, so that's going to be much more gentle and much safer. Which one's grammatically correct? More gentle or gentler? I don't know. Anyway, the last thing you will need is some form of lubricant. You can use like a water-based personal lubricant. I personally, however, prefer to use natural and pure oils. Some oils I recommend are almond, jojoba, coconut, rosehip, and vitamin E. You can also use olive oil, but please make sure that it is clean and not contaminated with other gunk. So perhaps not the olive oil that's been sitting in your kitchen for the last 6 months. Okay, so now for the method. The first thing you want to do is warm up the tissue. So go take a warm shower or soak a washcloth in some warm water and just hold it on your earlobe for a few minutes. And the reason for that is warm tissue is more elastic than cold tissue. Next up, you want to make sure that your hands, the taper, the plugs or eyelets, and your earlobe are all nice and clean. The way that stretching with tapers works is that they create little tiny micro tears in your skin, and that's broken skin, so you don't want to be putting bacteria in broken skin. That's not a good recipe. So once your earlobes are nice and soft and everything is all clean, it is time to grab the lube. And lube is your friend in a lot of situations, but it's definitely your best friend in this one. Lube decreases the friction between the taper and your flesh, and so it makes for a much more comfortable and much safer stretch. Lube is a necessity in this process, so please don't attempt it without using lube, because you're probably not going to have a good time. As you can see on this taper, about halfway along the taper stops and just becomes straight, and you want to apply lube all up until this point, as well as your earlobe. Once everything is all lubed up, insert the taper into your ear and start pushing it through. Now you want to take this very slowly and just push it through basically as slowly as you possibly can. It's normal to feel some tightness and resistance, but it should not hurt, and it shouldn't have so much resistance that the taper just stops going through. It's really important to listen to your body, so if your earlobe starts to hurt, or if the taper is becoming really difficult to push through, Stop. Remove the taper, put your old jewelry back in, and wait another week before trying to stretch again. Basically, if there's pain or a lot of resistance, it means the scar tissue inside the piercing isn't ready to be stretched yet, and forcing it to stretch before it's ready can lead to tearing or blowouts. And if you don't know what a blowout is, go back and watch the first episode in this series. Now, if you are able to push the taper all the way through to the front without any pain or major resistance, then congratulations, you have just stretched your ear up to a bigger size. What you need to do now is swap out the taper for your jewelry. The jewelry needs to have at least one end with no flare, so it could be no flare altogether, or a single flare, or if you're going to use a double flare, it needs to have a screw off back. So you grab the piece of jewelry, which should be the exact same size as the taper, i.e. the end of the jewelry that's going through your ear needs to have the exact same diameter as the widest point of your taper. And then all you do is line up the butt of your jewelry with the front of the taper and push it through until the jewelry is in your ear and the taper is not. And then, secure it with O-rings or a screw-on back or whatever, and then you're done. Now, you need to wait between each stretch. You can't just do one taper after the other, after the other, after the other. There are a lot of mixed opinions when it comes to how long you should wait between each stretch, but I'm gonna link an article in the description below which has a good chart on how long you should wait between each gauge. The next stretching method is taping, which is quite simply the process of wrapping more and more and more layers of tape around your jewelry to very gradually increase the size over time. This method is more so for the larger sizes, for example like 2 gauge and beyond. It can be really fiddly to do in the smaller sizes. The things you will need are some single flare or no flare plugs or eyelets in the size you are currently at, a roll of PTFE or bondage tape, and please only use those tapes as any other tapes are unsafe. And of course, our slippery best friend, lube. So taping your jewelry is literally as simple as just wrapping layers of tape around your jewelry. Because PTFE tape is so thin, you probably want to start off with around 4 or 5 layers, whereas bondage tape is quite a lot thicker, so start off with maybe 2 layers. Once your jewelry has got a couple layers of tape around it, lube it up and lube up your ear and pop it back in. What you do need to keep in mind though is after you've wrapped layers of tape around the jewelry, you should still be able to get it in your ear easily and comfortably. You should not have to force it in. If you're finding it difficult to get the jewelry back in your lobe, remove a couple layers of tape and then try again. So once you've taped your jewelry and it fits back in your ear comfortably, you want to stay at that same size or that same number of layers for usually at least a week, or until you can pull the jewelry down and see a gap between the jewelry and your ear. During this time, it is best to replace the tape every single day and the same number of layers as well, just for hygiene purposes so that you don't end up with like a buildup of sebum and bacteria and dead skin cells and all that junk. To continue upsizing, all you need to do is start wrapping more and more and more layers of tape. So you'll do your first few layers of tape and then wait, and then start doing more layers of tape, and then wait, and then even more layers of tape, and then wait, and so on. And you just keep repeating that process over and over and over again until your holes are big enough to fit the next size jewelry. Lastly, we have dead stretching / using weights. Now, there are a few different opinions on how dead stretching is actually done, but the dead stretching process that I am referring to is when you literally just wait, and you wait, and you wait until eventually your skin has loosened up enough that you can just pop in the next jewelry size. And because you're just letting your tissue stretch at its own pace and in its own time, this is the gentlest method of stretching. However, this is only the gentlest method of stretching if you do it properly. Safely dead stretching is not about forcing in larger jewelry and just pushing it until it eventually goes in. That is not how you safely dead stretch. You can use gravity to facilitate or speed up this process, and to do that you just wear heavy materials such as stone or glass, or you can wear ear weights. I believe I mentioned this in an earlier episode, but once again, if you are going to use ear weights, it is best to wear them through an eyelet just to help more evenly distribute their weight and prevent things like uneven stretching and lobe thinning. So that's really all there is to the dead stretching method. You literally just wait until there's a nice gap between your ear and your jewelry, and then you lube up the next size jewelry and see if it fits. If it doesn't fit, just pop the previous size back in and keep waiting. So those are the safest methods of ear stretching, and if you are going to stretch your ears, or if you're in the process of doing so, please use one of these methods, and use the methods properly, so don't be skipping sizes and doing weird shit. In the next and final episode, I will be going over aftercare and basically the long-term maintenance of having stretched ears. So stuff about, you know, how to prevent them from developing a smell and stuff like that. So please watch that one. Follow me at these places to keep up with what I'm doing, and subscribe to be given a heads up when I upload my next video, and I will see you again in episode 5. Weird waving. Okay, bye.